My husband of 20 years, a tenured history professor, left me to go find himself with his college ex, a wellness influencer. He expected me to keep our home like a museum for his eventual return. So, I made one phone call to my lawyer and built an empire he could only read about. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday, delivered in a room the color of weak tea. Atypical viral pneumonia, the doctor had said, his voice gentle but firm. It's not life-threatening, Florence, but it will take a lot out of you. You need absolute rest, no stress. I remember nodding, my head feeling like it was stuffed with cotton wool, my body aching with a profound weariness that had settled deep into my bones. I was 46, an art historian who spent her days in the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the local museum, and I had never felt so fragile. The doctor's words echoed in my ears, no stress. It seemed like a simple enough prescription. I came home that evening to a house that felt unusually still. Arthur, my husband, was usually in his study at this hour, surrounded by teetering stacks of books, the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco clinging to the air. For 20 years, that study had been the engine room of our lives. He was a history professor, a man who lived more in the past than in the present, and I had always been his anchor, the one who managed the mundane realities of our existence so he could be free to wander through the centuries. I had supported his ambition, edited his papers, and organized his life with the same meticulous care I gave to curating a new exhibit. I found him not in his study, but in our living room, standing by the large bay window that overlooked the garden I so carefully tended. He wasn't looking at the roses, he was staring at his own reflection in the darkening glass. He turned as I entered, and his expression was one I hadn't seen before. It wasn't concern for my pale face or the slight tremor in my hands. It was a look of distant, almost clinical, resolve. "Florence," he began, his voice devoid of its usual academic warmth. "We need to talk." I sank into an armchair, the effort of standing suddenly too much. The fever was beginning to prickle at my skin again. "Arthur, I've just come from the doctor. I have pneumonia. I need to rest." "This can't wait," he said, and the coldness in his tone sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the illness. He walked over and stood before me, not as a husband, but as a lecturer addressing a student. "For the past few months, I've been feeling adrift, stagnant. I lecture on the great men of history, the explorers and the revolutionaries, the men who lived. And what have I done? I've studied their lives. I haven't lived my own." I stared at him, my mind struggling to keep up. This was a familiar refrain, a midlife melancholy that had been creeping into his conversations for months. I had suggested sabbaticals, new research projects, trips abroad. He had dismissed them all. "I need to go on a journey, Florence," he continued, his eyes fixed on a point just over my head. "A journey of self-discovery. I need to reconnect with the man I was before all this, responsibility." He gestured vaguely at our home, at the shelves filled with books we'd collected, the art we'd lovingly hung on the walls, the entire life we had built piece by piece. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "A journey? Arthur, I'm sick. I need you here." "That's just it," he said, his voice gaining a frustratingly philosophical tone. "You're so capable, you always have been, you manage everything. I've become complacent, a footnote in my own life story. I need to break free." And then came the final blow, the one that shattered the already fragile vessel of my world. "I won't be going alone," he said. He finally met my eyes, and I saw not a flicker of shame, only a strange, righteous determination. "I've reconnected with Serafina." Serafina, his college girlfriend, a woman I knew only from a few faded photographs and Arthur's occasional, wistful anecdotes. He had described her as a free spirit, a woman who lived by intuition and cosmic energy. I now knew her as a life coach and wellness influencer, a profession that seemed as nebulous and irritating as Arthur's newfound philosophy. She understands what I'm going through, he said, as if that explained everything. She's on her own path of enlightenment. We're going to travel together, find our authentic selves. The air in the room grew thin, and I struggled to draw a breath. The viral infection in my lungs felt like a minor inconvenience compared to the crushing weight of his words. He was leaving me, for her, and he was dressing it up in the cheap fabric of self-help jargon. "So you're leaving me," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "No, no," he said quickly, waving his hand dismissively as if I were a child who had misunderstood a complex theory. "Don't be so dramatic, Florence. This isn't an ending. It's a pause. I need you to keep the house just as it is. Look after things. This is my home base, my anchor. I'll be back once I've figured things out." He saw me not as a wife he was abandoning, but as a curator of the museum of his life, a caretaker who would dust the furniture and wait patiently for the master to return. He was placing our 20 years of marriage into a display case, closing the glass and walking away. He expected me to be his safety net, the stable, responsible woman he could return to after his adventure with a free spirit inevitably ran its course. The fever, the exhaustion, the shock, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying moment of clarity. I looked at the man I had loved, the man whose career I had nurtured at the expense of my own, the man I had built my world around, and I saw a stranger. He was a selfish boy wrapped in the skin of a 50-year-old academic, and his betrayal was more insidious than a simple affair. He wasn't just leaving me, he was demoting me. As he walked out of the room to pack his bags, leaving me shivering in the armchair, I felt the full weight of my diagnosis. But the ache in my lungs was nothing. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The days that followed Arthur's departure were a blur of feverish sleep and aching loneliness. The house, once a sanctuary of shared quiet and intellectual pursuits, now felt cavernous and hostile. Every book on the shelf seemed to mock me, a testament to a life that had been a lie. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by my own ragged coughing. I had dutifully followed the doctor's orders: absolute rest, no stress. But the stress was an infection of its own, seeping into my thoughts, leaving me weak and disoriented. My sister, Clara, came to stay with me. She was a pragmatic lawyer, my opposite in almost every way, and she arrived like a whirlwind of efficiency and righteous indignation. She filled the refrigerator with soup, managed my medications, and fielded the few calls that came in from concerned friends. She listened with a thunderous expression as I recounted Arthur's farewell speech, his talk of authenticity and journeys. "Authenticity?" Clara had scoffed, her hands on her hips. "The man is a walking, talking cliché, a history professor running off with a wellness guru to find himself. It's the most unoriginal midlife crisis I've ever heard of. He should be a case study in one of his own dreary textbooks." Her anger was a comfort, a shield against the pain that threatened to consume me. But at night, when she was asleep and the house was quiet again, the grief would return. I would lie in our bed, the empty space beside me feeling colder than the rest of the room, and I would trace the patterns of our life together. Had I missed the signs? Had I been so absorbed in maintaining the steady rhythm of our world that I hadn't noticed the deep cracks forming beneath the surface? About a week after he left, Arthur called. I saw his name flash on the screen and my heart gave a painful lurch. For a foolish, fleeting moment, I thought he was calling to apologize, to say he had made a terrible mistake. I answered, my voice still hoarse from the pneumonia. "Florence, are you there?" His voice was clear, annoyingly vibrant. I could hear the faint sound of wind and what might have been distant waves. "I'm here, Arthur," I managed to say. Good, good. Listen, I can't talk for long. The reception is spotty out here." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention my illness. "I'm calling about the quarterly property tax bill. It should be in my desk drawer, the top left one. It's due at the end of the month. Make sure you pay it from the joint account, will you?" I was speechless. He had called from his journey of self-discovery, from his quest for a higher truth with another woman, to remind me to pay a bill. The sheer, unadulterated selfishness of it was breathtaking. Also, he continued, oblivious to my silence, the subscription to the Journal of Medieval Studies is up for renewal. I had the form on my blotter. Don't let that lapse. It's impossible to get back issues. Arthur, I said, my voice dangerously quiet, I have pneumonia. There was a pause. Yes, you mentioned that. You sound terrible. You should be resting. It was said not with sympathy, but with the impatience of someone whose plans were being inconvenienced. Look, I have to go. Serafina is leading a sunrise meditation and I don't want to be late. Just handle the bills, please. I'm counting on you to keep things in order back home. And then he was gone. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear. Listening to the dial tone. I'm counting on you to keep things in order. He had truly left me in charge of the museum. I was the caretaker, the administrator, the one who handled the tedious logistics while he was off living. Anger, hot and pure, began to burn through the fog of my grief and illness. It was a clarifying fire. That night, unable to sleep, I wandered into his study. The room was exactly as he had left it. Books piled high, notes scattered across his desk, the faint smell of his pipe tobacco still lingering in the heavy curtains. It was the heart of his world, and I had been banished from it. I ran my fingers over the spines of the books, histories of empires, biographies of great men, tales of conquest and betrayal. He saw himself as one of them, a man destined for more than a quiet, academic life. And I was the domestic footnote he had to escape. I sat down in his large leather chair, the one he had spent thousands of hours in, and looked at the life he had so carelessly abandoned. My eyes scanned the shelves, the awards, the framed degrees. And then, a thought, small but insistent, began to form in my mind. It was a memory, a detail about our finances he had always dismissed as unimportant, a part of my life that he had never bothered to understand. It was a structure my father had put in place years ago, a safety measure from a man who had always been a better judge of character than I was. A quiet strength began to replace the shaking in my limbs. Arthur was a historian. He was obsessed with the past, with known facts and documented events. He believed he knew everything about our shared history, our assets, our life. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. Arthur, in his academic arrogance, and Serafina, in her spiritual vaporousness, had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten to check the fine print. To understand the depth of Arthur's betrayal, you have to understand the life I had willingly, lovingly built around him. We met in graduate school. He was the brilliant, passionate historian who could make the driest details of the Carolingian dynasty sound like a thrilling epic. I was an art history student, quieter and more methodical, fascinated by the stories objects could tell. I was captivated by his intellect, by the sheer force of his ambition. He was going to be a great man, a respected academic, and I wanted nothing more than to be by his side. When he was offered a tenure-track position at a small but respectable university, we moved without a second thought. My own career aspirations, which had once included working at a major metropolitan museum, were downsized. I took a position as a curator at the local museum. It was a pleasant job, but it was safe, predictable, and most importantly, it didn't interfere with Arthur's needs. His work always came first. I was the one who managed our social life, our home, our finances. I typed his manuscripts, organized his research notes, and hosted dinners for the department heads who held his career in their hands. I poured my own intellectual energy into his work, finding satisfaction in his successes because I saw them as our successes. I remember once, early in our marriage, I was offered a prestigious fellowship to study Renaissance art in Florence, Italy, for 6 months. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. I presented it to Arthur, my heart thumping with excitement. He had listened patiently, then gently explained that it wasn't the right time. He was on the cusp of getting tenure. He needed my support at home. "There will be other opportunities, my love," he had said, kissing my forehead. "Our life here together is the masterpiece we're creating." I believed him. I let the opportunity pass. There were never others. I became an expert in a life I had curated for him, my own ambitions carefully packed away and stored in the attic of my mind like a painting that no longer fit the decor. Now, that life felt like a cage of my own making. and the person who held the key was Serafina. I did what any modern, betrayed woman would do. I looked her up online. Her digital presence was as polished and disingenuous as I had imagined. Her website was a wash of pastel colors, script fonts, and photos of her doing yoga on picturesque cliffs. She described herself as a guide for souls in transition, a curator of authentic living. The irony was so thick I nearly choked on it. Her professional history was vague, a degree in liberal arts, followed by years of travel and spiritual exploration. She offered expensive online courses with titles like Unlocking Your Inner Narrative and Manifesting a Sovereign Existence. It was a vocabulary designed to prey on the insecure and the unfulfilled. It was a vocabulary that had clearly worked on Arthur. Her blog posts were filled with thinly veiled contempt for the life he had left behind. She wrote about escaping the beige cage of domesticity and breaking free from the anchors of expectation. One post, in particular, felt like a direct attack. It was titled, "Are You Living a Life or Curating a Museum?" She wrote about people who surround themselves with objects and routines, mistaking stability for happiness. True authenticity, she opined, is found in the wild, not in a carefully temperature-controlled room. That was the moment I truly understood her. Serafina wasn't just a former flame, she was the architect of Arthur's departure. She had seen his midlife dissatisfaction not as a problem to be solved within his marriage, but as an opportunity for her. She had painted me, his wife of 2 decades, as the antagonist in his life story, the dull, restrictive curator of the museum he needed to escape. She had repackaged his selfish desires as a noble quest for enlightenment, with herself as the enlightened guide. Their joint social media posts began to appear a few weeks later. Photos of them on a beach, their faces tilted toward the sun, with captions about breathing in the universe and realigning our energies. In one photo, Arthur, my Arthur, who considered dressing up to be putting on a tweed jacket that wasn't covered in chalk dust, was wearing a loose-fitting linen shirt and a beaded necklace. He looked ridiculous, like a man playing a role he didn't quite understand. But he also looked happy. Or, at least, he was performing happiness with a desperate conviction. What was most galling was their casual and repeated mention of their financial freedom. "We've shed the material burdens to focus on what truly matters," one caption read, posted alongside a photo of them drinking expensive-looking green juice at a seaside cafe. They spoke of their journey as if it were funded by cosmic goodwill, not by the joint savings account that I had so carefully managed for 20 years. They were living off our money. My money. The money I had saved, invested, and grown while he was lost in the 18th century. They were using our shared history to finance their escape from it, and Serafina was right there, encouraging him, framing his financial irresponsibility as spiritual purity. She was a fraud, and she had turned my husband into one, too. The turning point came not in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet of my father's old study. After weeks of listlessly drifting through my own home, a ghost in the museum of my former life, Clara's pragmatic voice finally broke through the haze. "Stop mourning, Florence," she had said, her tone sharp but not unkind. "Start planning." She was right. The anger that had been simmering beneath my grief was now a clean, cold flame. Arthur and Serafina saw me as a passive caretaker, a relic to be left behind. It was time to remind them that relics can have immense, undisclosed value. The memory that had been nagging at me since Arthur's phone call about the bills was of a conversation with my father, years ago, shortly after he had set up my inheritance. My father was a self-made man, a shrewd businessman who had built a small manufacturing company from the ground up. He respected Arthur's intellect, but had always been wary of what he called his financial romanticism. Arthur lived on a professor's salary and viewed practical money matters with a certain academic disdain. "This is for you, Florence. Only you," my father had told me, tapping a thick legal document. "It's in an irrevocable trust. The principal is protected, and you are the sole trustee and beneficiary. No one can touch it, no one can lay claim to it, and no one can compel you to dissolve it. Not a husband, not a creditor, nobody." At the time, I had been almost offended, assuring him that Arthur and I shared everything. My father had just smiled. "I know you do, sweetheart. Just think of this as a piece of art that belongs entirely to you. It's your personal collection." I had filed the documents away, and over the years, the trust had simply become another line item in our financial portfolio. Arthur, despite being a financial advisor's nightmare, knew of its existence, of course. But in his arrogance, he assumed it was just another marital asset, a pot of money that had blended into our shared wealth. He had never once asked to see the paperwork. He had no idea of its unique, impenetrable structure. This was the clever trap my father had laid, a safety net woven with legal steel. My first call was to my father's old estate lawyer, Mr. Hemlock, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a mind like a razor. I explained the situation, my voice steady and clear. He listened without interruption, and when I was finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Florence," he said finally, his voice holding a note of profound satisfaction. "Your father was a very wise man. Let me be perfectly clear. Arthur has no legal claim to a single penny in that trust. It is as separate from your marital property as the moon is from the earth." A wave of relief so powerful Tea almost buckled my knees washed over me. "What do I need to do?" "You need to legally and financially separate yourself from him immediately," Mr. Hemlock advised. "We'll start by moving all the liquid assets from your joint accounts into a new account in your name only. We will then draft a letter of separation, informing him that you are filing for divorce and that all financial support from your end is terminated, effective immediately." The plan was audacious and terrifying. It meant dismantling the entire financial structure of our 2-decade marriage in a matter of days. But it was also liberating. For the first time since Arthur had walked out, I felt a surge of power. I was not a victim waiting for her husband to come home. I was the master of my own fate. With Mr. Hemlock handling the legal side, I turned my attention to the personal. I needed to understand who Serafina really was, beyond the glossy facade of her online persona. Her vagueness was a red flag, and I decided to invest a small portion of my newfound financial freedom into clarifying the picture. I hired a private investigator, a discreet professional recommended by Clara. "I want to know everything," I told him. "Her financial history, her past relationships, her real business dealings. I'm not looking for dirt, I'm looking for the truth." The investigator, a former journalist named David, was efficient and thorough. Within a week, the first report landed in my inbox. What it contained was both shocking and validating. Serafina, whose real name was Sandra Potts, had a history. She had left a trail of failed wellness ventures across 3 different states. There were small claims court filings from unpaid vendors, disgruntled clients demanding refunds for retreats that never happened, and a string of romantic partners who all told a similar story. She was charming and magnetic at first, but she had a remarkable talent for living off other people's money before disappearing when the funds ran dry. She wasn't a spiritual guide. She was a predator who specialized in men having midlife crises. She found successful, stable men who were feeling lost and sold them a fantasy of a carefree, authentic life, a fantasy they paid for. Arthur wasn't her partner on a journey of discovery. He was her latest investor, and our joint bank account was her seed capital. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a con. And Arthur, my brilliant, intellectual husband, was her willing mark. The knowledge didn't make me sad, it made me furious, and it solidified my resolve. I wasn't just taking back my life. I was going to make sure they couldn't use my resources to destroy it. The investigation was no longer just about protecting myself. It was about gathering the evidence I needed to dismantle their entire fabricated world. The letter from Mr. Hemlock, formal and ruthless, was sent via courier to the last known address for Arthur. A holistic wellness retreat in a coastal town that was, according to my investigator, more of a shabby collection of rental bungalows. The letter clearly stated my intention to file for divorce, the immediate freezing of all joint accounts, and a formal declaration that the assets within the F.L. Albright Trust were my sole and separate property. For good measure, Mr. Hemlock included a copy of the original trust document, with my father's unambiguous language highlighted. I knew the call would come, and I was ready. It came 2 days later. The caller ID showed Arthur's number, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a deep, steadying breath. I sat at the large mahogany desk in what I was now calling my study, a glass of iced water at my elbow. "Florence, what is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, his voice a frantic mixture of outrage and disbelief. There was no greeting, no preamble. "I got a letter from some lawyer. He's making wild claims. Our accounts are frozen. I couldn't even pay for our lunch today. It was humiliating." "Hello, Arthur," I said, my voice calm and even. It was a tone I had perfected in museum board meetings when dealing with difficult donors. "I assume you received the documents." "Documents, it's nonsense, that trust. That's our money, Florence, it's marital property. You can't just take it." "Actually, I can," I replied, taking a sip of water. "As the trust document clearly states, it is, and always has been, my sole and separate property. My father was very specific. It seems you never bothered to read the details." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to process this new reality. The intellectual superiority he had always wielded was useless against the cold, hard fact of a legally binding document. "This is absurd," he finally managed. "This is completely out of character for you. You've never been like this." "Perhaps you never really knew." "W my character, Arthur," I said. "You only knew the parts that were convenient for you." Suddenly, another voice cut in, high-pitched and indignant. "What have you done?" It was Serafina. She must have grabbed the phone from him. "You are radiating such negative energy. You can't trap a soul that needs to be free with petty financial games." "Hello, Sandra," I said, using the name my investigator had uncovered. The silence that followed was even more profound than Arthur's. It was a silence thick with shock and fear. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice losing its airy, influencer lilt and becoming sharp and common. "This is Florence," I said, "Arthur's wife. And I know who you are. I know about the retreat in Sedona that went bankrupt. I know about the yoga studio in Oregon with all the unpaid instructors. I know that Serafina is a brand, and your business model is finding men like Arthur and draining their resources while selling them a fantasy." "You're lying," she shrieked, her voice cracking. The mask of the serene spiritual guide had not just slipped, it had shattered. "Arthur, she's trying to poison us. This is the toxic energy I warned you about." I heard a muffled scuffle as Arthur presumably took the phone back. His voice, when he spoke again, was shaken. "Florence, what's she talking about? What do you know?" "I know," I said, leaning back in the leather chair, "that your journey of self-discovery has been funded by a joint account that is now empty. I know that your enlightened partner has a history of leaving her partners in financial ruin. And I know that as of this morning, you have no access to any of my money. The money you were using to pay for your humiliating lunch today, that was my money. The roof over your head in that bungalow, paid for with my money. Your authentic new life was a franchise, Arthur, and I have just revoked the license." I could hear Serafina shouting in the background, a string of words that were decidedly not spiritually aligned. Arthur tried to interrupt. "Florence, wait, we need to discuss this. This is a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," I said, my voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as marble. "You made your choice. You chose to leave your life and your responsibilities behind. You just made one critical miscalculation. You assumed the curator you left in charge of your museum was both stupid and powerless. You were wrong." Before he could respond, before he could formulate another argument or excuse, I ended the call. I placed the phone gently back on the desk. The silence in the study was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. It was the sound of control. The first major confrontation was over, and I had not raised my voice. I had simply presented the facts. Serafina's hysterical, panicked reaction was the only confirmation I needed. Their carefully constructed world of spiritual superiority had just collided with reality, and the foundations were already crumbling. The fallout from that phone call was immediate and desperate. Arthur began calling incessantly, his messages shifting in tone from outraged indignation to wheedling confusion. "Florence, please, pick up. We need to be rational about this." Then, "I think you're having some sort of breakdown because of your illness. Let me help you." And finally, "Serafina says this is just a test from the universe. We can overcome this if we just communicate." Serafina, meanwhile, launched a pathetic counteroffensive on her social media. Without naming me directly, she posted a series of cryptic messages about energy vampires and souls trapped in materialism who seek to punish those who fly free. It was a transparent attempt to control the narrative, to paint herself as the victim of a vindictive, scorned woman. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so pathetic. Her followers, the ones who paid for her wisdom, left comments of support, offering to send healing light and positive affirmations. They were trying to regain control, but they were working with a faulty map. Their world was built on feelings and cosmic interpretations. Mine was now being built on legal documents and verifiable facts. While they were busy posting inspirational quotes, my investigator, David, was compiling his final report. And it was a masterpiece of understated devastation. He had found 2 more of Serafina's former partners. One was a dentist from Arizona, the other a software engineer from Northern California. Both were intelligent, successful men who had been at a low point in their lives when they met her. Both told a chillingly similar story, a whirlwind romance built on promises of a more meaningful existence, a gradual entanglement of finances, and a sudden departure by Serafina once the money ran out. The dentist had lost nearly $100,000 he had invested in one of her wellness ventures. The software engineer had co-signed a lease on a luxury apart. Meant she had abandoned, leaving him with the debt. Neither man had pressed charges. They were too embarrassed, too ashamed of their own gullibility. But David, with his gentle persistence, convinced them to provide sworn affidavits detailing their experiences. These documents were legal dynamite. I forwarded the affidavits to Mr. Hemlock, and then I did something that even surprised myself. I forwarded them to Arthur. I sent them to his university email address, the one he checked with academic reverence, with a simple 2-word subject line, "Your predecessors." I attached the sworn statements from the dentist and the engineer, along with the public records of Serafina's various failed businesses and court judgments. I didn't add a single word of my own. The evidence spoke for itself. This time, the silence from his end lasted for 4 full days. I imagined him in that shabby bungalow, the sea breeze doing little to cool the sweat on his brow as he read through the stories of the men who had walked this path before him. I pictured the confrontation with Serafina, her airy excuses and spiritual justifications crumbling under the weight of documented history, his own area of expertise. He was a man who dealt in primary sources, and I had just handed him a collection he could not ignore. The second confrontation came via a strained, halting phone call. His voice was completely different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated tone. "I read what you sent," he said, the words barely a whisper. "I thought you might find it interesting," I replied coolly. "A bit of historical research." She said they were jealous exes," he stammered, "that they couldn't handle her spiritual energy." "And do you believe that, Arthur?" I asked. "You, the man who taught me the importance of cross-referencing sources and verifying facts. Do the sworn affidavits of 2 professional men in 2 different states who have never met each other but tell the exact same story strike you as the ramblings of jealous exes?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched on, filled with the static of his crumbling certainty. "She lied to me," he said finally. It was a statement of dawning, horrific realization. He wasn't just in a relationship, he was the subject of a repeating historical pattern. Yes, she did, I said. But you were a willing participant, Arthur. You wanted to believe the fantasy she was selling because it absolved you of all responsibility. It was easier to call our life a beige cage than to admit you were simply bored and selfish. I could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven. The spell was broken. The wellness influencer had been exposed as a common con artist, and the noble quest for self-discovery was revealed for what it was: a cheap, predictable affair funded by stolen money. What am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice sounding small and lost. It was the question I had been waiting for. The dynamic had shifted completely. He was no longer the lecturer, the one with all the answers. He was the lost student, asking for direction. "That," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy, "is part of the journey you were so eager to begin. You wanted to live your own history. Well, this is it. This is your moment. You need to figure it out for yourself." I paused, letting the weight of his new reality settle upon him. "My lawyer will be in touch regarding the divorce proceedings. Do not contact me again directly." I hung up the phone, not with anger or triumph, but with a quiet sense of finality. The last vestiges of the man I had married had evaporated. In his place was a fool, stripped of his pride and his wallet, and I was finally, completely free. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my own reinvention. With a portion of the funds from my trust, I left my staid position at the local museum and founded Albright Art Advisory. My deep knowledge of art history, combined with a network of contacts I had cultivated over 20 years, proved to be a powerful combination. I started small, advising local collectors, but my reputation for having a keen eye and unimpeachable integrity grew quickly. I was no longer just curating exhibits, I was building world-class private collections. I traveled to auctions in New York and London, my professional life becoming the adventure I had once sacrificed. I renovated the house, replacing the dark, heavy furniture of Arthur's study with light, modern pieces, transforming it into my own elegant office overlooking the garden. The house was no longer a museum of a dead marriage. It was the vibrant headquarters of my new life. The divorce was finalized with quiet efficiency. Arthur, represented by a beleaguered-looking public aid lawyer, did not contest a single point. He was a ghost of his former self, humbled and adrift. Serafina had, predictably, vanished the moment the money had run out, leaving him with the remainder of the bungalow L's and a mountain of credit card debt they had accumulated. He had retreated to a small, rented room near the university, his academic career now the only thing he had left. The story could have ended there, with his quiet ruin and my flourishing success. But fate, it seemed, had a more dramatic final act in mind. 6 months after the divorce, I was honored by my alma mater with a Distinguished Alumni Award for my contributions to the arts and my entrepreneurial success. The ceremony was a grand affair, held in the university's historic main hall, the very same hall where Arthur still lectured. It was a black tie event, filled with donors, trustees, and the university's most esteemed faculty, including the entire history department, including Arthur. I chose my outfit with meticulous care, a tailored emerald green silk gown that was both elegant and powerful. I felt a nervous flutter as I walked into the hall, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. This was not a confrontation I had sought, but it was one I would not shrink from. It was a public validation of the life I had built from the ashes of the one he had destroyed. I saw him across the room. He was standing with a few of his colleagues, looking thin and diminished in an ill-fitting tuxedo. He saw me at the same moment. His face went pale, and he looked for a moment like he might turn and flee. But he was trapped, cornered by social convention. The dinner was a pleasant affair. I was seated at the head table with the university president. From my vantage point, I could see Arthur at a table near the back, picking at his food, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Finally, the moment came. The president walked to the podium and began his introduction. He spoke of my long career, my recent success with Albright Art Advisory, and my resilience and vision in forging a new path. Then he welcomed me to the stage. I walked to the podium, the applause of the crowd washing over me. I looked out at the sea of faces and my eyes found Arthur. He was staring at me, his expression a mixture of awe and profound regret. He was finally seeing me, not as his caretaker or his footnote, but as a woman in her own right, celebrated for her own achievements. I began my acceptance speech, thanking the university and my mentors. Then, I decided to depart from my prepared remarks. They say that history is written by the victors, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. But as a historian myself, I know that's not entirely true. History is also a story of what is preserved, what is curated, and what is discarded. I saw Arthur flinch at the word curated. For many years, I continued, I curated someone else's life. I preserved their legacy, their comfort, their ambitions at the expense of my own. I believed that was my masterpiece. But true art, like a true life, requires authenticity. It requires you to be the artist, not just the caretaker of the gallery. The room was silent, captivated. I wasn't being accusatory. I was simply telling my story, a story many in the room could probably relate to in their own ways. When that life was suddenly deaccessioned, I said, using a museum term for removing an object from a collection, I was left with an empty gallery, and I had a choice. I could leave it empty, a monument to what was lost, or I could fill it with a new collection, one of my own choosing. I looked directly at Arthur then, my expression not one of anger, but of a kind of serene finality. I chose to build, I said. I chose to become the artist of my own life, and I have found that the freedom to create your own narrative is the most valuable acquisition of all. Thank you. The hall erupted in thunderous applause. As I walked back to my seat, I saw it, the final, powerful moment of realization in Arthur's eyes. It was the look of a man who had not just lost a wife, but had witnessed the unveiling of a masterpiece he had once owned and casually thrown away. He had left to live his own history, only to find himself a forgotten footnote in the far more compelling history I was now writing for myself. He pushed back his chair, and without a word to his colleagues, walked out of the great hall, a man finally and irrevocably erased from the exhibit. The aftermath of that evening was definitive. Arthur's quiet exit from the awards ceremony was, in its own way, the final chapter of our story. Friends who were there later told me it was the talk of the faculty for weeks, the quiet, unassuming wife of the tenured professor, emerging from the shadows as a powerhouse in her own right, while he simply faded away. He had become a ghost at the institution where he had once been a respected figure. A few months later, I heard he had taken an early retirement, citing health reasons. He sold his collection of rare books to pay off the last of his debts and moved to a small town upstate, disappearing into the obscurity he had desperately tried to escape. As for Serafina, her downfall was less dramatic but equally complete. With the sworn affidavits from her previous victims, Mr. Hemlock sent a carefully worded letter to the state attorney general's office, outlining a pattern of deceptive business practices and potential fraud. While it didn't lead to a criminal case, the official inquiry was enough to shatter her already flimsy credibility. Her website went offline. Her social media accounts went dark. Sandra Potts, the curator of Authentic Living, had to find a new identity, this time without a financial backer to fund the transition. Justice, in her case, was the quiet, digital erasure of a life built on lies. My own life, in contrast, bloomed in the space that had been cleared. Albright Art Advisory became more successful than I had ever dreamed. I hired a small, dedicated staff and opened a beautiful office in the city. My work was no longer just a job, it was my passion, fully realized. I traveled, I learned, and I surrounded myself with people who valued my intellect and my vision. I built a new circle of friends, people who knew me as Florence, the founder and expert, not Florence, the professor's wife. One afternoon, about a year after the divorce, I received a package at my office. It was a small, carefully wrapped box with no return address, though I knew who it was from. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a single, beautiful Roman coin, ancient and worn smooth by time. It was from a collection Arthur had cherished, one he had always said was irreplaceable. Tucked beneath it was a small, handwritten note. "I finally understand history," it read. "It's not about the great men, it's about what survives. You survived, I'm sorry." I held the coin in my palm, its cool weight a tangible piece of a past that no longer hurt. It was not a plea for reconciliation, but an admission of defeat, a final, unconditional surrender. I didn't feel triumph, nor did I feel pity. I felt a quiet sense of peace. He had finally learned the lesson that had cost him everything. I placed the coin on my desk, not as a memento of my broken marriage, but as a reminder of my own resilience. It was a historical artifact from a lost civilization, the civilization of my former life. My healing was a gradual process, like the careful restoration of a damaged painting. There were moments of sadness, echoes of the 20 years I had invested, but they were fleeting. They were overshadowed by the vibrant colors of my new reality. The freedom to wake up in a home that was truly my own, to make decisions based solely on my own desires and ambitions, to build something lasting that bore my name alone, that was a masterpiece far greater than any I had ever curated for him. I had not just built a new life. I had uncovered the person I was meant to be all along, a woman of value and substance, hidden for too long in someone else's shadow. And she, I realized, was the most priceless piece in my entire collection.